Hello everybody, my name's Star Raptor and this is a video about George Lucas. I just recently finished George Lucas A Life. This is written by Brian J. Jones. I got this one for Christmas. Now typically I don't read biographies, I'm more of a fictional novel kind of guy. But since this is about George Lucas, I wanted to learn everything about the guy that influenced a huge part of my life with Star Wars. And I'm really happy I did because Brian J. Jones did an awesome job from the beginning to the end of just really talking about every little tidbit about George Lucas's life. There's a lot of little facts in here that I never knew about the guy. So in general, George Lucas did so much more than Star Wars. He really just paved the way for independent filmmaking. He really set the standards for visual effects and sound, and he predicted a lot of things that would come in later years. This guy was an absolute visionary, and I'm so happy that he was able to do what he did. And, you know, it is just amazing how much this guy had influenced Hollywood in general. So I'm going to just go through chronologically of a lot of little things that I picked up in this biography and just share them with you guys because I thought so much stuff was so fascinating in this biography. So first off, I don't know if you guys knew, but he was really into cars around the 60s. He used to race cars. He was kind of a greaser at the time. He was kind of, you know, with these little ruffian guys, and they would go around driving their cars at night doing street races. He grew up in Modesto, a small town in California, and he actually got into a really bad accident that almost killed him right around the time that he was going to graduate high school. So he recently put in this special racing seat buckle, and when he got in this accident, the seat buckle actually broke and it launched him from the car, which actually ended up saving his life later on. So if it wasn't for that seat buckle that he put in there, he would have been probably dead or just completely paralyzed or something. And it's interesting to note because of this accident, he was in jeopardy of not passing high school, and because of this accident, he actually had the sympathy of his teachers to end up passing him for his grades. And mainly one thing he didn't like in school at all was writing. Writing to him was just nothing he wanted to ever do. And that is just crazy because he created Star Wars with such a rich universe. And it wasn't until he met Francis Ford Coppola, the guy that directed Godfather and a lot of other classic movies, actually kind of, you know, mentored him on writing. So that was really, really awesome. Something that really made George Lucas pissed off about Hollywood was how they, you know, manipulated with his own film. His own independent work was ruined because of them. His first feature film, THX 1138, as well as his following film, American Graffiti, were tampered with by the studio, editing, taking 4 minutes out of each film. That would just, you know, it just jeopardized his vision, and he got really ticked off. And ever since that occurrence, he was always striving to create some kind of independent company of his own that he can invite other filmmakers into. And that's something I really liked about George Lucas, or I like about George Lucas, is that he's such a giving man. He makes so much money, but he really provides the world through charity and through other people in general. Okay, so later on in life, this is during the Vietnam War, he actually didn't get drafted because he had diabetes. So that was something interesting I found. With American Graffiti, this was the first movie that actually had a soundtrack. Now, it was kind of funny because for American Graffiti, he was kind of going around promoting this as a musical, and a lot of the actors, like Ron Howard, was like looking at the script and like, I don't want to do a musical, and George Lucas is pretty much like, oh, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. Because what he meant by musical is there's a lot of hit musicians in there, like Chuck Berry, you know, the Beach Boys, and it's a lot of really awesome stuff that, you know, they had to pay a lot of money for. This was coming from Universal. They had to pay the money for the rights. But just the way that they put in the music, it was very natural. They actually recorded, George Lucas himself recorded the music being played in different environments, so it felt like when you're entering a scene, it was coming from like a car radio or a stereo or something like that. So that was really cool because this was really the first official soundtrack to a movie. American Graffiti was his first successful film. Unfortunately, THX 11 didn't really catch on with the mass audience, although the sci-fi nerds out there would really embrace this as an awesome film. But American Graffiti, it was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and it actually won a Golden Globe for its screenplay. And during the time that George Lucas was creating American Graffiti, this was back in 1972, that's when he conceptualized Star Wars, and he was going around shopping to sell, to basically distribute American Graffiti, and that was part of the package. Was I have this space opera that I'm developing, so if we're gonna do this, can I actually have you release this as well? So originally, Star Wars was supposed to be a Flash Gordon movie, which is this TV serialized show that he would watch as a kid. Unfortunately, to get the rights for this movie, it was just astronomically high to the point where it was impossible for anybody at the time to really afford it. So at that point, he's like, alright, let me make my own thing. Star Wars actually took George Lucas 3 years to create. He would go through many different iterations and characters and titles, stuff that we would even see in a current movie, Rogue One, a Star Wars story. They took some elements from that, such as the Guardian of the Wills, and May the Force of Others be with you. That was straight from his first couple scripts, so that was really interesting. Parts of Star Wars, the theme was almost kind of taken from what was going on in the real world, then kind of politically charged toward the Vietnam War. You got the rebels, who are this ragtag group of people going against the Empire that kind of symbolize, the United States as the Empire, with the people, the Vietnamese as the rebels in a way. So that was really interesting. One of the funniest things I've actually read out of this biography that had me dying of laughter was this one part where obviously we know that George Lucas and Steven Spielberg have been friends from a very early age. They were both kind of competing against each other, but in a brotherly kind of manner with their films. So at the time, Spielberg was creating Jaws, okay? And of course, he invites George Lucas over to show him the actual shark, who I think is named Bruce now. Correct me if I'm wrong. So it would be funny. Spielberg thought it'd be funny if he, had George Lucas kind of put his head in there and look around and close it on him. Well, he didn't know that the thing would malfunction, and George Lucas's head would be caught between the jaws of this huge animatronic shark, and he couldn't get it open, and they just kind of ran away. Spielberg and his friends just kind of left George Lucas there in the wind. I thought that was just freaking hilarious. So moving back to Star Wars, they're casting for the role of Han Solo. At one point, George Lucas was pretty much going to have Christopher Walken do it, and I thought that was really interesting. As we know, Harrison Ford also played in American Graffiti, and before that, he was a very accomplished carpenter that worked for very high individuals in Hollywood, even bands like The Doors. He was helping out with some projects. So after American Graffiti, he went back to carpentry, and when they were actually doing the auditions for the other actors, he was actually at the same place they were doing auditions, and he was working on a door frame or something like that. And then George Lucas kind of was like, hey, you want to just come over here and say a couple lines? And he was really reluctant to do it, but he did it, and they found out they had great chemistry between all, the big three, Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and him, and it was, history ever since that. But the thing about Star Wars was George really wanted this to be independent from, the distributor of Fox. So in order to do that, he basically said, I'm going to use all the money pretty much from American Graffiti, which was a successful film both critically and money-wise. So he used that money to pretty much pay for most of the movie, and it was pretty much the distributor was just to Fox. And at the time, that was kind of crazy because nobody really had that money, by themselves without the studio's help to kind of throw around for a movie budget. But it worked. Something I thought was really funny was this editor that was working on Star Wars, and I forget his name, but he was like, I can't do something like Star Wars. And George kind of went back at him and said, oh, that's okay. No one's ever have. Kind of this is kind of impossible. And George is kind of yep, I know, but we're going to make history kind of thing. So that was really cool. So Star Wars was actually nominated for Best Picture in 1978. It won pretty much every category out there. The only thing it didn't win was Best Director and Best Picture. It won a ton of visual effects awards. John Williams won an award for the best score. Something funny about Star Wars, another thing between Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, was a lot of their movies they would bet for points of the movie, meaning they would get a percentage of the movie at how much it grossed, and they would constantly get that through time. So Steven Spielberg actually bet 2.5% points with George Lucas on in his other movie, and so it ended up like Steven Spielberg to this day I think made like over 40 million bucks because of that point of how much Star Wars has made, which is just entirely crazy. So at the same time that built up the hype for Star Wars, basically the hype was built up by, you know, all the toys, all the comics, all the novels. That's what would make it such a big hit. It was such a big hit that Kenner couldn't even provide the toys at the time of release. So what they had to do is they had to mail away these kind of like cardboard placeholders saying like, you will get your toys, but here's their little stand for the toys until we actually get them to you. So that was kind of interesting because they wanted to cash in on that craze, but there was literally nothing they could give to them at the time. So George Lucas created Pixar, and it was basically he created it for getting these people. He didn't even call it Pixar. It was the people I worked for called Pixar. But he got a bunch of these computer tech guys to try to create some kind of video editing software to help with editing. But he didn't know behind their back they were actually working on like computer animation, which eventually spawned into Pixar. But in the end, George Lucas always had trouble with this group of people that he wanted them to make the computer editing software, but they were too busy making these animation things, which he didn't like. So eventually when, you know, things got a little down for them and they were starting to lose a little bit of money, he had to cut some slack, and he actually let them go and sold them off to Steve Jobs for a couple $1,000,000. And now, you know, Pixar is a multi-billion-dollar company, which is insane. Alright, so ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, which George Lucas created. I thought this was kind of ironic because the very first CGI scene in a film ever was created by ILM for the movie Star Trek II Wrath of Khan. So basically ILM is not just for Star Wars, obviously, but it's basically can contract or work with any other studio around the world that has the money for them. So that was really cool. Something that Lucas created for the world was the THX sound. So it requires a studio to kind of reposition their speakers around, but for them it would create the best immersive experience. So Lucas had a huge hand in influencing it. I think there's like 4,000 or something movie theaters out there that are now THX certified, the best, like the gold standard for the way sound is in theaters. So George financed Empire Strikes Back completely by himself. He only let Fox like basically have distributing rights, and basically the reason why he did that again is because when he made his first the first Star Wars, they still had a little bit more power Fox, and I think Fox had like 60% of the profits, and George was basically going crazy saying, and his logic made perfect sense, like, hey, look, like they hindered some of the movie like by rushing him. Why should they get more money than him on the movie when he did all the damn work? So yeah, I could definitely hear his frustration from that. Basically, Empire Strikes Back, the sequel to Star Wars, in George's own mind, it seemed like the reason why he wanted to do a sequel to Star Wars because he had this project in the back of his mind that the only way he could finance it is if he made another movie, and what better movie to make a sequel to make a ton of money than the highest grossing film of all time, Star Wars. So yes, he made Empire Strikes Back to basically create Skywalker Ranch, which would then become like the headquarters for you know, his independent filmmaker buddies to come out there and, you know, not be tampered with by the big studios out there. Something really interesting in the concept art by Ralph McQuarrie, during the Empire Strikes Back, he had this Vader's castle, which I thought was great because we've just seen that in Rogue One. Sorry if you're watching this, that might be a little bit of a spoiler alert there. So Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was actually a very different movie than Raiders of the Lost Ark, who, you know, was basically George Lucas was the writer along the whole Indiana Jones series. So, you know, if you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom is a little bit dark, and that is because both Spielberg and George Lucas were going through a tough time in their personal lives. Namely, George Lucas had gotten divorced from Marcia Lucas at the time, and, you know, he was just going through a lot of loss, and that's why the movie was basically like that. And Temple of Doom was actually the very first PG-13 movie ever. They were going to rate it rated R, but it wasn't quite there, and it was definitely not a rated PG movie, so they actually created it just for that. So Star Wars to George Lucas before the special editions in 1997, according to him, this is a direct quote, is, "Oh God, that's so awful. I can't watch this." That was his direct response to Star Wars. And like I said before, Fox had really rushed him a lot on that movie. They didn't give him the budget that he really needed. He only had a certain amount of money, so that's why he would ultimately go back to the special editions, was to really create that. George Lucas had a lot of pain when making Star Wars. He ended up having pain in his heart at one point, I think, and it was just so much stress because when you think about it, they were doing the filming in London at Elstree Studios, but then ILM was based in Los Angeles. ILM was, behind on a lot of the work for the special effects, so you constantly had Lucas going back and forth, and especially with the original Star Wars, he was the director, so he was involved a lot. But even though he wouldn't be the director in Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi, he was still so much in the work, like with Irvin Kershner, the director of Empire Strikes Back, and Mark Quand, who was the Return of the Jedi director. He would be over their shoulders, pretty much like a director anyway. He could not let this project go without his supervision. So that really did it for him, and it was really making him not wanting to do the prequels for a very long time. Speaking of the prequels, we all know and love Jar Jar Binks, at least I do. And Michael Jackson at one point said to George Lucas that he wanted to play the role of Jar Jar Binks really badly. He was a big Star Wars fan, and they've had conversations in the past because they used to work on a Disney project for the theme parks way back when. But unfortunately, George Lucas said if Michael Jackson was in the credits for a Star Wars movie, he felt like Michael Jackson would take too much out of Star Wars. Like everybody would be looking at Michael Jackson, obviously, because he's one of the biggest names in entertainment. It would take away from Star Wars. So the prequels were made pretty much without anybody saying no to Lucas, because at this point, Lucas had lost a lot of the creative talent necessary for bringing the original trilogy. So first off, a lot of the people that would speak up to him, such as his wife, Marcia Lucas, who also was an editor throughout his time on American Graffiti and the original trilogy, she always would kind of come up with criticisms, and he never took them that well, and ended up that once they got divorced, he wouldn't have to hear from her. Also, another one that would be a producer was Gary Kurtz, who also a lot of times would kind of argue a little bit with Lucas about what was going on. So now that either of them were both out of the picture, he had a lot of, I guess you could say, yes men that would kind of just never say no to him. So a lot of the things that you guys argue with the prequels, I personally love the prequels, but a lot of it can be accounted to Lucas not having that kind of workforce to really say no to a lot of his decisions. Moving on to some more merchandising facts. So Star Wars was actually the first license for Lego, so that was really cool. Another cool fact is, and I really like this one, so apparently in Britain at one point years and years ago, there was a census that went around and asked, what's your religion? Well, 390,000 people of Britain actually recognize themselves as being a Jedi as a religion, which would make it the fourth largest religion in Britain. And this was years ago. I'm not really sure like what the stats are now, but that is just freaking awesome, guys. So another thing that was interesting about the production of the prequels was that George a lot of times didn't even have the script ready and they were already filming. Usually when you do a movie, you got your final script and then it goes into production with casting and everything else filming. But he would actually like do the script, shoot something, and then actually would redo the whole scene, add another scene. It was almost like reshoots he was creating in a sense, with he was able to go back and shoot these things and everything else because he would keep the sets up. And a fun fact about Revenge of the Sith is originally they were going to have Han Solo in there at the age of 10 years old helping out Yoda to find General Grievous. Fun little fact right there, really cool. Lucas actually was a better director in the prequels. So a lot of the times you've seen probably documentaries and whatnot of Lucas during the original trilogy. I mean, he's generally been a very quiet, kind of stoic person that didn't really show much expression or emotion, and you would hear that on the set. He would just say faster, more intense, and that was kind of the only feedback he would give his actors. Well, now during the prequels, I guess he would have a lot less stress in his life. His projects wouldn't be as risky, so he kind of played it cooler. And generally, he actually admitted that Revenge of the Sith was his funnest movie that he ever made, mainly because he had his 3 adopted children on the set with him pretty much all the time. They were actually all in a scene together at one point, which is pretty cool. So another thing that was really cool, as I was saying before in the beginning of the video, is Lucas actually was a visionary in that he was able to predict a lot of things that come in the future. So years before video cassettes, he would say like, oh yeah, there was going to be something to allow people to watch videos after the movie left the theater. So that came true. Then he actually predicted streaming, so like downloadable content. Obviously Netflix is huge today. He actually talked about pretty much massively multiplayer online games where people would actually interact with other people, and he actually pretty much came up with the idea that there would be some kind of shopping you could do at home. You would never have to leave the house, aka Amazon. So he made one of his last movies he made was Red Tails, and it had such bad reviews and bad vibes from the critics that this is what really caused him to retire and eventually basically be sold to Disney by Bob Iger. So in that deal, Disney would get full control of Star Wars, and George was really arguing. George wanted to have the control of Star Wars but still sell the company off to Bob Iger and Disney, and they just wouldn't really see through to that deal. So eventually George did just give in and give everything to him. But the deal was that they would use George's story treatments for the new trilogy. That would be 7, 8, and 9. They would have to use those treatments, and they didn't, which is what really caused the rift between Disney and George. Now, George says he likes The Force Awakens, but I could almost kind of tell that he's just saying it because he sort of has to say it in a way. Although the Rogue One, he says he loved it, and I could definitely see him why he might have loved the Rogue One more, because it ties into his very first Star Wars film. But even though they wouldn't use his stuff, it was said, really interesting, that George would sit on some of the early story meanings for The Force Awakens. So that goes to show you that he attempted it, but then somewhere along the line, Disney, they just kind of took it and were like, all right, J.J. Abrams, you could do what you want. Alright guys, so that was basically a bunch of little information I found very fascinating. I hope you guys did too. Basically what I got from this biography was a newfound appreciation for George Lucas that I've never had before. I really did feel sorry that he kind of parted with Star Wars and now people aren't using his ideas. It's kind of, I kind of feel a little mixed feelings about that, honestly, especially reading how his reaction was. But George Lucas is a man that needs to be celebrated, obviously. If you look behind me, all of that stuff is because of that guy, and I just can't thank him enough. So guys, please get out there, support Brian J. Jones. Please buy his book, George Lucas' Life. It's awesome. You won't regret it. Thanks for watching. I'm Star Raptor, and may the Force be with you always. So did you like the video? Then make sure you rate it a thumbs up, and if you did that, go over there, hit that Star Raptor head to subscribe to my channel. Doing so will keep you up to speed on all of my latest content. Speaking of which, you can see a couple of my recent uploads down below. I'm also on social media, so what are you waiting for? Let's start nerding out.